In this episode, we explore the concept of spirits using interactions, waveforms, and the evolution of the universe. Welcome to the Bottom Turtle Podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Bottom Turtle Podcast. My name is Dr. Shannon Ray, and we're joined by our co-host Oyani Onimiya. How are you doing, Oyani?
I'm doing okay, Shan. What up, though? How you doing?
Man, I don't know if I feel that. I don't know if that's true. He said he's feeling okay, but we just had a bit of a disaster. We recorded this entire episode, and just to find out that his recording software stalled like 20 minutes in.
20 minutes in.
Re-record everything. Yeah. That's the current. I mean, you know, I feel like I should be more angry about this. I really honestly feel like I should be like seething right now or depressed, but for some reason I just don't give a fuck. Like, I don't know why, but it doesn't bother me at all.
Yeah. But but it's yeah, you know, it was bound to happen, like you said. So, you know, we just gotta roll with it. But yeah, you were telling me we got an email from someone.
It's actually kind of ironic because we did get an email from a listener. His name is Christoph, and he wanted us to interview this guy on Instagram. His name is the Blue Buddha, and he has this podcast called the Lotus Underground podcast, and it's gives lectures on teaching the Buddha and different sutras and all this. Mm-hmm. And Christoph suggested an episode to me called and let me look it up real quick, The Demonstration of the Inconceivable State of Buddhahood. It's a first episode on a 3-part series on this topic. And it's actually funny because in that episode, at one point, he talks about how in a previous episode, he was giving a lecture on letting go. And he gave the whole lecture and realized that he didn't record any of it. And so he had to immediately let go of the anger, of the state of being in the state of like disappointment and anger at not getting it. Cause he just taught that, he just taught letting go. And so we are experiencing the exact same thing. Ironically, you know, when talking about this dude, he must have a curse.
Because right as soon as we also realized we had to let it go. Yeah.
You know, honestly, I think the reason why I'm not so upset and I kind of just let it go is because at the end of the episode when we recorded it, you had mentioned like, man, we should have started off with this conversation, and I was like, man, that you're right, man. It would have been really perfect starting off our episode with this. So it's almost like now we're forced to redo it. So it's like, you know,
all right,
we can make it better. It'll be all right.
Yeah, but I think the email was great. You were telling me about it and about I can't remember exactly how the dude put it. It was something about everything is equal, or
it's the conditional. Yes. It's the state of the unconditioned is what he says. The inconceivable state of Buddhahood is the state of the unconditioned, and he says that the Buddha said the absent of thought is the state of the unconditioned. And more specifically, the thing I want to focus on is he says something like the real nuts and bolts of our world, even language is conditional. And I think that statement is actually a statement of is actually an information theoretic statement, because everything conditional has to do with like relationship. It's all relational, and then it's all relational. It's all correlations, and you get the correlations of structure, and you're in information. So that's pretty much what it is. And I'll go into more detail about that. But then the thing that really I like is he says, it is the state of emptiness because all states and views are equal. And as I was saying in our defunct episode, that is actually an algebraic statement. Man, I feel like I'm talking too loud. This mic's too loud. But that's actually an algebraic statement. And the way that you can conceive that as being an algebraic statement is that algebra is all about symmetries. It's about changing things without changing them. And so when you're looking at the symmetries of something, you can look at it in terms of constraints and the things that are consistent with a set of constraints. So in his podcast, when he's talking about the conditional, you can think of the conditional as constraints. And when you're looking at something like a piece of paper, and that the examples he used in his episode was he had an audience and he was talking about making lines on a board, and he was showing that if you put a line on the board, that doesn't mean anything, it's just a line. But then when you start putting other lines and other symbols and curved symbols and stuff around that line, suddenly it goes from meaning nothing and it starts to mean something. And it's that relationship between those symbols and how they're arranged that starts to go from a state of the unconditional to a state of the conditional. And it's going to that state of the conditional that is like adding constraints data. So before, if I had a blank piece of paper, that's a completely unconstrained system. And then when I start adding constraints, it doesn't go from the set of all possible things that goes onto the paper to nothing. It goes from the dimension of all things it could be to all things that it could be that's consistent with that constraint.
Yes, constraint.
Yeah. And so, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and like I was saying, it's the same as the crossword puzzle that I like to use as an analogy all the time, because it's literally the difference between having a blank piece of paper and a crossword puzzle on a piece of paper. Because the crossword puzzle has now defined your constraints now. It's defined, in the space of all ideas, what could it possibly be? The same like if you have a line on the board, if you have just one line in the space of all ideas, it could be all kinds of things. And then you had one more diagonal line, then it's like, is it an L shape? Is it the number 7? Now you start to like have all these pictures in your head. So yeah.
Yep. And it's the exact same thing. And so to tie this back to the unconditional state of Buddhahood where everything is treated as equal, the best way to conceptualize this is in terms of like a computer or a cell phone that it's just been freshly constructed, and no software has been placed on it at all. So when you look at your physical system, there are all these different states that it can be placed in. And with no mentation without representation, if I'm in a specific state of being, then that is an actual rearranging of the configuration of the system. And so for a fact that if you have a phone and you take a bunch of pictures, every time you take a picture that gets stored as memory or take a video that gets stored as memory on your phone, and eventually you run out of memory. So now the thing is in a configuration where all of the freedom to be placed in a different configuration has been taken from. And so there's no freedom there. So if you're looking at this conditional state of this unconditional state of Buddhahood, just imagine that you're erasing all of the data that has been stored on that cell phone to the point where it doesn't even have an operating system on it. It's just completely in a state where it can be programmed in
either Android or iOS at that point.
Yeah, it can be put in whatever. It has full potential to be placed in any configuration like a blank piece of paper. Yep. And so the reason why this is all connected to algebra is when you add constraints to something, what that does is it goes from a dimension, like on a piece of paper where you're in the dimension of all things, all thoughts that are possible, to a restricted space, just like with the crossword puzzle. Like when it says when you start filling in the crossword puzzle, that starts putting more constraints on the system. And so the space, when you're trying to find the words that get put in the slots, the space of possible words is smaller than it was before you started filling it out.
Yep.
And so when you're trying to search in that space, all of the things that are consistent with the constraints are equally possible. They're equally likely, and that's where the algebraicness comes from. Because
it's pretty interesting. I might have to check out the podcast and give it a listen.
But one other example that I wanted to use to kind of explain this is the idea of, if you are a person, we know from, like we said, no mentation without representation, that there are these all these possible states that your system can be placed in. And when you're at the point where you're like a blank slate, to where you're not placed in any configuration, when you're in that state, then you have, when you're thinking about what this human computer could be thinking about, you're in the space of all possible things. But then let's say that you place a constraint. So now it went from being in this state of Buddhahood to where now it's in a state of thinking about humans. So you just went from a space of anything to a space of just humans, which is a constraint that makes you go from a larger dimensional space to a lower dimensional space. But then you can add another constraint. And so when you add that constraint, at that point, all humans are equally likely to be what they're thinking about. Like you cannot say that they're thinking about one human versus another because it's just humans. That's the only constraint. But then when you add, like, say, American, so human American, that takes that space from humans, it goes to a smaller constraint. Then you go from American to Black American. Now you have the set of all Black Americans, which is a smaller dimensional space. And the more constraints that you place, the size of the space of things, the dimension of that space gets smaller and smaller. But everything that is consistent with those constraints has to be treated as equally likely as what someone's talking about, because there is no other data to restrict it down to anything less than like Black American human. Yeah. So that's our take on that.
That's pretty cool. Yeah. Hopefully we'll be able to get guests, I guess, on the podcast shortly. Like you said, we have a couple of episodes, planned out. So once we get through that, then we can start to do that. But I think it'll be fun to kind of see how we can tie in, information theory and some of these ideas to something like Buddhism, for example.
Oh, yeah. I mean, for me, I would love to, right now in the podcast, we are setting up the language. So even in the first season, we're just setting it up. And now in the second season, we're still setting it up because, like we're saying, it takes forever to build this correlated network of concepts so that when we say specific things,
you can always what we're find where you are
today. Yeah, we're talking about spirits. Like when you talk about a specific thing, we want it to mean something very specific. So we have this huge network, and so we're still trying to set that up. But eventually, in the future, I would love to talk about try to interpret, right now I'm actually doing some Bible study stuff with a friend of mine, and he's like a Southern Baptist dude. He's a very conservative dude. He's a friend of mine from grad school, and he's still a really good friend of mine, and we like to go through and read the Bible and talk about different interpretations of things, and I like to give the information theoretic point of view. And so I would love to talk about that stuff. All human thought is interesting to me.
But yeah, I'm glad that we at least got that email.
You say what?
I'm glad we got that email from Christoph. Shout out to Christoph.
Yeah. Sorry, Christoph. We can't have we're still trying to set up the language, so we have already ideas for the next 3 or 4 episodes. So we don't really have room for guests at the moment, but hopefully this response is sufficient.
Yeah. But yeah, back to regular scheduled events. Like you learned a few minutes ago, we're recording this again because the first.
Are you sure? Are you sure it's recording?
It is. Calm down.
I'm going to give you shit about this forever, man.
But yeah, we're doing it all over again, second time around. You had mentioned the idea of what was that? The Instagram post that you had seen that said something like, "Oh yeah, when you were born, you're handed an identity and a religion and a race, and you spend all your life defending it." And so we came across this.
No, you gotta say it. You gotta say it.
I gotta say it, right?
As soon as you are born, you are given a name, a religion, a nationality, and a race. You spend the rest of your life defending a fictional identity.
Yeah. And this was kind of an interesting thing that we stumbled upon this week, and we talked about it earlier in the week. And what's funny about that is, like you said, it's such a unappreciative statement, even at its best, because it's almost disregarding, almost completely rubbishing everything that was handed down to you. And that's once you start to see all of those things like your religion and all that stuff as
your family traditions,
it's
nationality,
stuff that was passed down to you, obviously from a place of love, wasn't from a place of hate or whatever. And so statements like that, it kind of removes from it takes you away from feeling appreciative enough. We're not saying you have to agree with everything that was handed down to you, but at the very least, that level of appreciation of all of those past experiences of your parents all bottled together into this nugget for you that is your religion or your family traditions and things like that. And we routinely see comments like this online. I don't know, you were telling me about the group you follow that posted that.
Oh yeah, so on Instagram I follow a bunch of different spirituality pages. I think the one that is I think there's this one's from something called Truth Guidance, and there's Children of Light and all these things. And the thing about it is I kind of view that system of thought as kind of being a religious system. And like any system, there are things in it that are good, things in it that are I disagree with, and then things that are just outright like
Ridiculous.
at the level of magical nonsense. And so it's a matter of every once in a while I come across really decent stuff on these things. Like one of them was something that said, like, I want to wake up every day being proud of the reality I've created for myself, or be proud of the life that I've created for myself. And it's like, yeah, that's solid advice. They talk a lot about, your relationships and getting rid of toxic people and all these things. So I would say that 85% of the stuff that I get from these pages are actually just solid, decent things to live by. 5% of it is like nonsense. Like, if you like this, then the universe will give you $1,000, which is just complete garbage. and then the other 10% of it is like stuff that I just disagree with. And I think that this one about defending a fictional identity, I just disagree with, because it seems like it comes from a place of hate. It doesn't come from a place, as you were saying, from appreciation from what was given to you in the past. And it automatically assumes that these things that are given to you, or like your religion, your culture, your nationality, that all this stuff is just given like somehow arbitrarily, and that it's fake. Whereas, when your parents are teaching you stuff and they're giving you like the foundations of how they think, they're passing their spirit onto you essentially. And a lot of times, most parents, they do this out of love. And so if you are unable of identifying the things that are passed on to you that come from love, and you think that you can just dismantle it all and start from scratch and call it all fake, then that's completely unappreciative of the past. And it just comes off as, it comes off like we were saying before. There's a reading of this that could be charitable, in which it's just trying to say something like, you don't have to hold on to everything that's given to you, and like, yeah. And that's completely right. Like, your parents give you a stuff, your nationality and all these things. They give you a culture, they give you a way of thinking, they give you a worldview. You don't have to preserve all of it, but at the very least, you should give it enough benefit of the doubt to identify what's good about it, what should be preserved, and what should be changed and modified and improved. And I just feel like that this statement doesn't give room for that. It just gives room for smashing it all
with a giant hammer.
Yeah, no nuance.
No nuance at all. And so even parts of your religion or your culture that you don't agree with as you've grown older, that's a decision that you have to make on your own. But at the same time, you should still be able to look back and go, oh, you know what, I see the point. This makes sense. I see, this part of the culture. I appreciate it. It's not serving me right now. Like, I'm a perfect example, because my childhood was in Nigeria, and it's very easy for me to say, a lot of the cultural things that were passed down to me, how to do this and do it this way, things like that, are things that I can just throw away and say, oh, doesn't serve me anymore, and all that stuff. But especially because, living here in America is you're playing a completely different game. So a lot of those cultural, norms and rules and ideas and, things like that probably won't serve you here. But I can definitely look back and, just still feel a level of appreciation for some of these things that were passed down, and still pick and choose different things from it. I was talking to my good friend a few days ago, and in Nigeria, there's this system of saving where a group of people come together and they save money. And how it works is, so it could be 5 friends, and we say we're going to save $200 every month. So how it works is, on the 30th day of the month, everybody comes together and they put their $200 into a pot, and they give it to one person in the group. And then at the end of the next month, everybody puts $200 in the pot, and then they give it to one person in the group. So it goes around, and essentially, I could look back at that, from where I am right now and be like, oh, that's a lame idea. That's dumb. Why would anybody want to do that? But what I can appreciate from it is, this teaches you a lot about how to save money. It teaches you, so of course, if I want to save my money, I don't need 5 people to come together to help me save it, because essentially that's what it is. But at the same time, I can go put it in the bank. I could, invest it, do whatever I want with the money. But that piece of my culture, or that was something that was, how my people essentially did their banking or their savings, quote unquote, is something I can still look back on and appreciate. And know, the idea behind this was to just create that culture of saving money.
Yeah. And it's always important to be able to go back and look at things and appreciate them, because I remember, like, I think that this little thing, I wouldn't give it the benefit of doubt to say that it's trying to say something more nuanced. I think that what I've seen consistently through these, through a lot of it, is this idea of rebelling against the past.
Yeah.
And you see it consistently. And I remember on one of the ones that they posted on one of these pages, they said something about like the joy of identifying the things that your parent, like the conditioning that your parents gave to you, and rebelling against them. And there is something valuable about going through and finding out what your parents gave you and shedding some of that conditioning. And most people, through a teenage years, like when you're a kid, your parents give you your entire reality. They give you everything that you should do. They set your rules. They do all this stuff. Ideally, yeah. And then when you become a teenager, you start to rebel against it. You start identifying, you try to find your own identity. And it's one of those things where there's something good about going through that rebellion and picking at some of the things they said and creating some freedom, just like in the Buddhahood thing. Like you're like, when you remove structure, you're creating freedom to create something new. And but what's really great about it is once you've lived a while, and then you go back and you look at the stuff that your parents gave you, and you're able to appreciate it more. And it's one of those things where, yeah, rebellion's great, but having some life experience and then going back and be able to love and appreciate and see that the rules that are in your nationality, in your culture, in your family, and seeing that these rules are actually designed to protect you and they're actually loving. That's actually something that that needs to be appreciated just as much as the process of questioning and breaking stuff down.
It's really easy to lose sight of that and just see it as a, this isn't serving me. I need to just rip this apart and, create something new.
Good luck starting from scratch.
Good luck starting from scratch. Exactly.
Yeah. But the thing that I think is good about this little statement about defending a fictional identity is that you have to really start asking yourself, what is your identity and what is the self? Because when you think about what you're inherent and what you inherit, both in terms of genetics and culture, in both cases, those things are just waveforms. They are just things that are placed on physical matter that affects the state, the configuration of the universe. Like, no mentation without representation. We know that different thought processes are different configurations of your physical system. And so if something is in the configuration of a dog, that's different than the configuration of a human. And so in both cases, whether it's genetic information or cultural information, both of these are just a blueprint for how to structure physical matter, like how to put it in a specific state. And so when you're trying to think of what you are as the self, you have to start thinking, it's like, okay, am I the physical matter that makes up the system, or am I the blueprint that arranges the matter so that it's in one state versus another state? And to kind of conceptualize this even clearer, you can think about the fact that your physical, like the actual physical matter that makes up your system, that's replaced. Like a lot of the matter that made up you at the beginning of your life, it's not the same matter anymore.
So obviously that can't be yourself.
That obviously can't be yourself, because as that's replaced and changed, there's something else that persists as that changes. And so what is the thing that is not made of physical matter that persists as that physical matter is replaced? And we would argue that thing that persists is actually the waveform. And so if waveforms are just these things that determine the state of a system and what configuration it's in, then when a parent passes you down their waveforms, their states of being, you inherited that just as you inherited your genetic material. Which one of these is the self, the waveform, or is the self the matter? And so it's not as simple as just saying that the stuff that's being passed down to you is fictional. I don't think that's the correct way of looking at it.
It definitely is not. But it's interesting you bring up waveforms, and I'm hoping that we can kind of explain what that means.
Oh yeah, we're gonna get into it, yo. Especially we know we already did the episode. We're just repeating it pretty much.
Oh my God,
But that's actually kind of better because I feel like now I'm in the correct state of being. And it's actually something. So when we started off the episode last time, we actually started off with a discussion about, and y'all will never hear this conversation now, but we started off with a conversation about how before the podcast, whenever we start recording, I'm usually pretty nervous.
Yes.
And the reason why that is because what we're trying to do in this show is we're trying to communicate these ideas. We're trying to communicate them in the most effective way possible, the clearest way possible. But we also want to do it. We want to do it clearly. We want to do it effectively. We want to make it smooth. We want to make it conversational. We want to represent the best version of our arguments. And to do that, you have to be in a specific state of being to get into a flow. And I'm more in a flow now that we set recording the second time than I was the first time. But that flow, that state of being in this flow of talking about this stuff freely, that's a different state of being than when you're not. And it's like you're trying to conjure that state of being so that you're in that flow state.
It's good, but and I think that these waveforms, like we were saying, preserving these waveforms is kind of what we're talking about, how a spirit emerges, nurturing it, feeding it, keeping the interactions consistent that bring it to life. It's how a spirit emerges, essentially.
So remember, everything we're doing is a matter of causal structure. We assume that the universe has a configuration, it has a setting of degrees of freedoms, and it evolves from one state to the other. And so the waveforms that can be placed on matter are independent of the actual physical matter. So if you identify that a certain state of matter is in a specific state, then you can actually look at that waveform that's on that matter, extract it, and then place it on some other matter. Like that waveform is independent. And so the reason why we're talking about waveforms is when you're talking about the evolution of the universe, that happens during interactions. So when two things interact with each other, you go from a state before interaction and a state after interaction, and that process, that's the evolution of the universe. And so whenever you have a process like that, you essentially have information flowing. You have two things that interact, and that interaction is the process of information flowing. And when everything's interconnected, so when everything is able to ping each other and interact with each other, then you're always having the configuration of the universe is always fluctuating and changing through these interactions. And it's imagining that fluctuation and change that you can start imagining the waveform that is description of how the information's flowing through these interactions. And it's one of those things where if we're talking about stability of a state or stability of a configuration, there's like two ways to go about that. If a system is completely isolated, so it's not interacting with anything, somehow it's been completely isolated from the universe, then it has nothing to interact with, and so its configuration remains stable. The same. It's just stable, it's the same. But if it's connected to a network of things in the environment and it's interacting, now suddenly you can have information flowing and you can have certain waveforms and certain states of matter. You can have that stuff dissipate to where it's like taking a rock and throwing it in a pond. You take a rock, you throw it in a pond, you have one disturbance of the structure, and then that disturbance ripples out. And that rippling process is the interactions that's happening as the information's flowing. And then eventually the water settles and that structure no longer exists. And so this occurs when you have things that aren't isolated and they're interacting. And so if you want to have things stable, then you have to have a specific interaction happen over and over again.
Just keep dropping that stone at that specific weight and angle and speed or whatever, force on the water just to keep those ripples at that same size to keep it stable, preserve it, or, So essentially you can imagine that is an idea or a belief that your parents have passed down to you. And, you have to keep this thing stable because if you stop dropping the stone or stop, tweaking the string or whatever it is you have to do to keep it stable, if you stop doing that, it will dissipate and that will be the end of it. And so, that's why kind of why we're saying like a lot of these things are passed down to you, from a place of love, more often than not for your own survival, for your own protection, because at the very least, I would like to assume that every parent is at the very least trying to keep a child alive. That's you don't have to like buy them Jordans or whatever. You're just trying to keep them alive at the very least.
Yeah. Exactly.
And so most of these things, that's what it's for. And you have to do those things over and over again to really just keep that spirit almost stable.
Yeah, keep that stable. And it's like you were saying in the last episode about the idea of what you interacting with on Instagram, and then what you interact on Instagram, it starts changing your feed.
Yes.
And then that's like that process of drifting. And so that process of drifting is, if you don't keep the same interaction occurring, then that state will dissipate and no longer exist. And that's kind of like the drifting
process. It happens all the time too. Like once I notice my Instagram feed is starting to be more of one thing that I don't want, I just stop interacting with it. So for example, I have friends who routinely send me memes and funny videos. And I know that if I keep watching them, Instagram thinks, oh, he likes this. And they just keep feeding that to me. So once I start to notice that I'm getting more of those and I don't want to see them anymore, I just stop interacting with those messages that I get sent. So the moment I stop watching them, stop clicking on them or whatever, automatically I start to notice that I see less and less of these content that I don't want to see. It's the exact same thing. Yeah. Yep. I just did not want that spirit to be stable. I did not want it.
Yeah. No, you want the other one. So you behave differently, you interact with the universe differently, which is a different interaction, which creates a different reality. But so we have this concept of throwing the rock in the pond and having it just ripple and dissipate. But if you want to think about waveforms that are stable, then typically the interaction that is occurring over and over again happens from like a reflection. So instead of there being a pond with a clear pond, imagine that there's an obstruction, like a wall that's put into the water, and then you throw a rock next to the wall, and then you can see the ripples moving out, and then when it hits the wall, you can see ripples reflecting back on the wall and then moving back toward the center of the disturbance where the rock landed. And as you were saying, if you have a rock, or you can imagine a piston that's being held above the water, that's constantly moving up and down, up and down, so there's a constant amount of ripples going out, then you have a constant amount of reflected ripples going back in. And so now you have an interaction between the outgoing ripples and the returning ripples. And for physical systems, you can construct something called standing waveforms, where like one of the best examples to think about is just take a string and tie that string to the end of to a wall.
Kind of like when you go to the gym to do that. What's that?
Yeah,
thing?
Yeah, exactly. What they call those, battle ropes or whatever.
I don't know. Fight ropes, whatever.
Yeah, guys, you watching the? Yeah, somebody. I should know this. I don't know why I don't. But there's the battle rope things where you're like whipping them, and you're whipping them, and you can see those waveforms traveling toward the other end. And if you're doing this with a string attached to a wall, then take it, do one whip to make one waveform go down, and then you can watch it reflect off the wall and go back. And if you take your hand and you're constantly driving it, moving this thing up and down, then you're creating this constant stream of waves moving outward, but you have this constant stream of waves moving in. And depending on the density of the material, like the material of the string, depending on the tension in the string, depending on the length of the string, you have these different things called harmonic frequencies that depend on the physical properties of the system. And so if you're taking the string and you're moving it up and down at the harmonic frequency, then you start getting these things called standing waves. And these standing waves, they have these features called nodes and antinodes, where the nodes are just like single points, and then the antinodes, they're like humps. So these harmonic frequencies, there are different states of them. So you have the first harmonic frequency, which gives you 2 nodes and 1 antinode, and then you have the second harmonic frequency, which it increases the number of antinodes and nodes. So each time you go up as a different harmonic frequency, then it gives you different amount of nodes and antinodes. And these harmonic frequencies are multiples of each other. So you just go the first harmonic frequency, then multiply that times 2, and then multiply by 3. But the whole point is that when you look at these standing waveforms, they look like static things. Like they don't look
like it's going back and forth anymore.
They don't look like it's going back and forth. It's just a static thing, and that is the result of the outgoing waves and reflecting waves constantly interacting with each other. So now this is how you can conceptualize a waveform being stable, although it's not isolated, because now it's not isolated, but as long as you have the same interaction happening over and over and over again, then it can be stable over, it can have some time symmetry where it's stable over longer periods. And so this is the scenario we're in when someone's parents are passing down a certain way of thinking, because that blueprint of your state of being, you are a fluctuating system. So your system's constantly fluctuating. And it's when you act in accordance with the customs that have been passed down to you that you consistently have the same interaction, which consistently keeps you in a specific state of being, which prevents dissipation, which prevents the drift. And now you're preserving the state.
And I think that, from there is where the spirit emerges. And, it's now obvious that, that waveform is essentially what persists, like you said, even when your cells change over time or whatever, that waveform just persists and it's just there, and you nurture it and it's stable. And one of the,
what do you want to define spirit?
Yeah, one of the definitions that we have here for spirit, because and it's funny that we're using the word spirit so casually. I remember last season, last season we were kind of careful about, going into this realm of like spirits because we hadn't fully like built the world yet as much as we have now. So now we can pull from examples like the billiard ball example. And if you're someone who's been listening to the podcast, you're getting that imagery now, and you can kind of tell what we're talking about. So, I think, like you say, we have earned the right, I would say. We can talk about stuff like this. And, like I said, a spirit is essentially, you could say something spirit is the way it programs the universe and the way it is programmed by the universe during an interaction. Yes.
Interaction, yeah. And the funny thing is, if you actually go back and listen to previous episodes, we use that phrase a lot. We actually had already been talking about spirits, but we know that that's such a loaded term that it's like, well, let's just keep using the phrase how you program the universe and how you're programmed by. We use
all
that
the time,
phrase
but essentially that is what a spirit is. Yeah.
Yeah, if you go back and listen to the episodes and just replace that phrase with spirit, we're saying spirit every time.
Yeah. And that's just what a spirit is. And, for you to keep a spirit alive, for you to keep it existing, for you to keep it, for you to spread that spirit, I should say, or whatever it is you need to do, you have to feed it. You have to keep it consistent. You have to, constantly, that spirit needs that interaction.
Yeah, it needs that interaction. Yeah. And it's one of those things where what we're doing is we're taking the concept of spirit, and when we define it in terms of how something is programmed by the universe and how it's programmed by the universe, we're always tying it to the concept of an interaction. And so like we just made our argument, waveforms become stable based off the existence of a persistent interaction. What that means, though, is by tying it to this concept of interaction, we're tying it to the concept of the evolution of the universe. Because when you look at the billiard ball example, like you were saying, when two things interact, what the resulting configuration of the system is depends on the previous configuration of the system. And so when you're trying to predict what the future state of the universe is going to be, you have to have a model about what the configurations are of the two things that are interacting. And so now things get broken down when you think in terms of spirit, in terms of what is the configuration, what is a measurement outcome. Now everything is described in terms of measurement outcomes of what will happen when two certain spirits, when they interact, what's the resulting configuration that will occur. Because now it's coming down to observations, measurement outcomes, predicting the future. What's the configuration of the universe? Causal relations.
I think it's a less clumsy way to talk about, these types of topics, because it makes the idea of spirits almost real enough to be like a person. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because it's all relational. Because now the concept of a spirit is dependent on the relationship between the two things interacting. And that's the thing about the definition of spirit that we've given, is that to have because it's defined at interaction, at the point of interaction when the universe goes from one state to another, from the past to the present, from X to Y. When talking about spirit in that sense, you need two parties to interact. So now what you see is that the spirit of something is actually defined with respect to all things that thing can interact with. And so you've taken the concept of spirit and you've placed it on this network of all things that interact. And because of that, each thing carries the spirit of the other thing, because spirit is defined in terms of how these things are interacting. And so when you and I are interacting, you start to ask yourself, okay, you have the spirit of Shannon, you have the spirit of Oyani. And when you're trying to have a model of these two spirits, you can look at how they interact. But the more we interact with each other, the more shared experience we have, the more shared data we have. And that shared data affects how we interact with each other in the future. And so there's almost a part where when you interact with someone, you are carrying that thing's spirit as physical memory in your system. And I think that's something that we mentioned in the first episode of the first season about like someone's model of reality. And you can break it down into the set of all scenarios of what will happen during an interaction. And when you break it down in terms of all scenarios of what can happen during an interaction, then you're saying, what is the probability of this happening versus that happening? Now you're breaking it down into statistics. And so you can start breaking down spirits in terms of things that have a specific label. How do things with that label change the state of the universe during an interaction?
And once you, and just imagine like if you have the data to see that, okay, this happens over and over and over again, you can start to like define the spirit of that thing, of that system, of that interaction. The spirit then emerges because it's like, every time this interaction happens, 9 times out of 10, XYZ happens. Every time, Dave Chappelle gets on stage and puts words together this way, he gets the laugh. This way, he gets the laugh. Automatically, you're starting to build, that model. And it's just based off all the data that you have gathered. Yeah.
Yeah. And Dave Chappelle has the spirit of comedian. So then you start looking at, okay, let me look at all things that have the label of comedian. Okay. All right. So if you can make back predictions. Like if I were to take a comedian and put them in a room, like an open mic room, and then you took some person who has no relationship with the spirit of comedy, like they're not a comedian, they're not even funny. You can make predictions about what's going to happen in that room, given those people the opportunity to speak into that mic. And that's because the person has embodied the spirit of the comedian, and that spirit is an actual waveform. Like when you go up and you do stand-up comedy, you're getting all this experience, you're interacting with other comedians, you're doing stand-up, and that constant interaction is building up that data in your system to where now your system is in a configuration that embodies the spirit of comedy or of a comedian. And so when Dave Chappelle, goes up on stage, and as you were saying in our broken episode,
why you gotta bring that up?
He goes on. I'm gonna keep mentioning it. I'll stop doing it. But when he goes up on stage and he gives the punchline before he starts giving the joke, this dude is like a scientist at this point. Science is all about predicting the future. If this happens, does my theory or does my model of comedy, for example, can I predict that if I set up this joke in this way, that it'll make the audience react, and laugh? And it's almost to the point where he's taking, like when he's setting up his joke and he's getting ready for the punchline and everything, it's like he's taking fire, he's taking kindling, he's taking wood, he's stacking it up, he's pouring gasoline on it. And we all know what's going to happen if he throws a match on that thing. It's going to go out. It's going to go up in flames.
And and that's how the spirit itself arises. And once you start to like see it as a more physical thing than some woo, like you say, it starts to make more sense, and you start to even get a better idea about how much control you even have over the system in itself to develop a spirit that you want to preserve and you want to keep stable. Now if I want to keep this spirit stable, I have to interact with this thing over and over and over and over again.
Yep. One of the things that I think is important to try to hit home is the personification of spirits. Because even when you're starting to think about what you are yourself, like we were saying earlier in the episode, you're trying to break down what you are yourself, and you're imagining this thing that persists as the matter that makes up your system changes. Then that waveform that is independent of the matter, that thing, you can start seeing how important that is to the concept of the self. And so when you're thinking of these waveforms as spirits with personalities and wants and needs, you can make that jump by imagining your own system, like your own physical system. And your own physical system is a network of things interacting. Like within you can imagine it's like a network of billiard balls, and these things are constantly in flux with each other and interaction. It's like we were saying in the last episode, it's the oval, and then you have the circles, and then the circles are internally interacting with each other, which give rise to different configurations and different ways in which the oval behaves. And you can imagine that the digestive system, it is a subsystem within a larger system. It has wants, it has needs, and it can affect how the system behaves and affect the future state of the universe. And how is that any different than you yourself when you're the consciousness spirit? You're just a subsystem within a larger system that has a capacity to influence the behavior of the system. And so when you look at it that way, you can see how the consciousness has a relationship with the digestive system. The consciousness has a relationship with your reproductive system. It has a relationship with all these different subsystems within the larger system. Yeah, and so when you look at it that way, you can kind of see how those relationships that you have with like food, for example, or your relationships with sex, for example, you can look at that in terms of how do you have your relationships with your coworkers, how do you have your relationship with your friends or your family? Because in both cases, when you come and interact with a spirit that's external from your body, that external spirit has the capacity to influence you. It's sending you signals. It's applying. You're interacting with it. Like it interacts with the environment. When it interacts with the environment, like we're talking to you, it creates pressures in the air, which then comes and travels as sound to your eardrum, and then wiggles your eardrum, and then that ripples through your body and puts you in a configuration where you now have heard what they said, as opposed to the configuration before where you hadn't heard what they said. And now that is a force that's being applied to your system that can now influence your behavior and what you do, which is exactly what your digestive system is doing. And so with that symmetry, you can actually get rid of the illusion of the idea that somehow another human that's like a spirit that has some agency, but your digestive system isn't, you know? And so, but now you can kind of get rid of that illusion and be like, oh no, this is all about what are my relationships as the consciousness? What are my relationships with other spirits?
Other spirits, like how am I finding harmony between all these spirits who are vying for control, of the system? How do I find a way to ensure that one spirit is not putting their needs above the need of the group? And this is your job as the consciousness protocol, and you being in charge of it is being able to navigate that space and knowing that, these spirits are all, subsystems inside of me. And, the more I crank the lever, or what's that thing, hit that whip for those battle ropes, the more I do that over and over again, I'm keeping this spirit alive. I'm keeping the system stable. And then you can start to pick and choose. Same way if you have that one friend who hits you up and says, hey man, dude, let's go rob a bank. Yeah. The same way you're like, yeah, no, leave me alone. Yeah. Same thing.
Yep. Yeah. And it's that thing where just as you have a friend and you can identify, all right, this person usually gets too drunk and they usually want people to get drunk with them. And so this is a flaw, like I'm kind of judging this person because it's kind of a flaw of them, but you're not judging them because you're thinking, I'm so superior. What you're doing is you're making an assessment about that spirit and you're trying to figure out, okay, how do I interact with this thing such that I can avoid a catastrophe? How much influence do I want to have? Do I want to let this person have on my behavior? And it's the same thing with like your reproductive system. If you are a person who's in a relationship, or just in general, you're just trying to go around and not fuck everything you see, you're constantly getting signals from your reproductive system. Hey, you should look at that person. That's pretty hot. But you can't just indulge in those. So you have to go, okay, what is the flaw in the reproductive system that can lead to catastrophe? And then how much am I willing to allow this thing to affect the behavior of the system? And then once you figured out how much you're willing to allow that, you can start to determine, okay, which signals should I reject and which signals should I accept? And the thing about like the interaction of rejecting a signal versus accepting it, those are two different interactions. And so they result in two different configurations of the system. And so if I reject a signal, that's one configuration I end up in. If I accept the signal, that's a different configuration. But now that my configuration is dependent on rejecting or accepting signals, then when I go interact with something else, how I interact with it depends on whether I rejected or accepted that signal. So, and then my spirit has been affected, which means that when I interact with things, how the universe evolve changes. And it's one of those things to where that process of accepting, rejecting signals, that's how you tune the system. It's how you determine which interactions within the system that you're allowing to persist and continually like happen over and over again.
It's easy to start to conceptualize this even better when, like we talked about, the video game example, where once you start out a video game, you get like 15 points to distribute between, strength and mind, speed. And there was a video game I was playing recently that had that, and I chuckled to myself when I was trying to set it up, because the game was set up in such a way that you had to kind of pick how smart you wanted your character to be, and this would affect like what kind of clues you get from the environment. So when you have a video game like that, obviously, depending on what you're trying to achieve, in the game, depending on what the rules are, depending on what your goals are, what your dreams, aspirations, whatever it is. So just imagine that this is like, real life. And, you get 15 points. You could decide to give 12 points to strength and then split the other 3 points between the other attributes you want. But of course, that's not keeping the system in harmony. So basically what you have done is that you have given everything to the spirit of strength in lieu of everything else that the system needs to be stable.
Yeah, to be able to actually function in a way so that when it interacts with something, it has the capacity to interact in a way that doesn't put itself in the worst position. Because if it can't, if you put it all in strength and
none in speed, now you can't run away.
You keep screwed. Yeah, and I think that statement of not allowing part of the system, because like we were saying in the last episode, we have those type 2 biochemical configurations that process information to put the system as a whole in a worse position. So it uses memory to affect behavior to put it in a worse position. And I think that emerges from when you, for example, get a signal from your digestive system and you're just constantly eating and eating and eating and you're never rejecting that signal. Every time you do that, like we're saying, your configuration depends on whether or not you accept the signal or not. And so now the digestive system is getting higher and higher control. And now it's going from a 3 to a 4 to a 5 to a 7 to an 8. And now suddenly, if you want to start rejecting those signals, it's harder now.
Because you've given so much of the power to this one subsystem at the expense of all the other ones.
And that one subsystem, like, it doesn't know any better. It has a job. It has a purpose. And it's just like, I would think like the 7 deadly sins. I think that is a conceptualization of the 7 different spirits the 7 different spirits. And, we don't know exactly where they're located in the body, but we know that there has to be some matter in the system that's storing the waveform associated with these things. Just like, it's like memory on a phone. So these different spirits, they seem to be ones that if you don't have a healthy relationship with them, meaning you don't have a relationship where when, all right, nope, reproductive system, I'm in a relationship.
Well, I can't indulge in lust right now.
I can't indulge in lust right now. I can't go there with you. But that's not to say that lust is evil or bad. It's just like, what's the correct setting? Maybe lust should be at a 2 or a 3.
Your sex drive is somewhere inside of lust. There's a setting there that is just right, and that's where your sex drive is. Now, if you jack it all the way up to 10, that's when it becomes a problem.
Yeah. Yep. That becomes a problem, and the sex drive, your lust, it doesn't know. It's just like, oh well, I have this thing, and the thing keeps giving me control.
I'm just going to keep
getting
doing
what I want, and so I'm just going to keep doing it, and that's why it seems as though, as the consciousness protocol, it's its job to filter signals. It's its job to judge right from wrong, good from bad, and it has the responsibility to do that, to try to advance the position of the system to be in a better state. And so because the consciousness has this relationship with all these subsystems, all these spirits, it has the responsibility to create harmony among them. To be like, nope, digestive system, you have to be at a 3. Reproductive system, we'll put you at a 5 right now because I'm pretty thirsty and I haven't gotten laid in a while. So we'll put you at a 5. And so And so it's one of those things where it's just trying to create balance. And
the harmony, like you said.
do it. Yeah. And you do it through your ideal. So you have some sort of ideal state that you want to be in. And then you make judgments based off those ideals. And then through those judgments, you tune the system to where it's more in line with your ideals. And hopefully, if those ideals that you have are ones that are waveforms that love the system, then they will be constantly putting it in a better position. Hopefully, it's not a waveform that you're over here making all these sacrifices for, and it's like more devious than your digestive system. It's more devious, and it's actually feeding you delusions and constantly putting you in a worse position.
Yeah. So just imagine that you're the master of your own video game, and you have all of these points, and you get to pick and choose, based off of how do you want this game to go? Do you want to be, there's some great video games out there right now that you could pick and choose how your persona wants to be. Do you want to be
Persona?
No, Persona's a good one. But yeah.
Persona. That game, I tell people, like, especially Persona 5, because I haven't played the other one, so I can't vouch for it. But Persona 5, play that game as though it's telling you what reality is. It's not just metaphors. They're like literal metaphors. It's telling you what reality is.
It is a very, very well done game. And, but yeah, it just kind of gives you that picture of knowing, what do I want my life to be like? AKA, how do I want to go through this game? Do I want to go through this game running through the game? Do I want to go through this game smashing through it? And that would just help you pick and choose how you dial back those settings. So, if you want to get to the Olympics, you have to know how to dial your digestive system spirit all the way perfectly to where, I got to turn it up today, turn it down tomorrow, turn it up. You're not making the Olympics. It's that simple.
Just like mixed martial artists, they're always talking about the weight cuts and stuff. Like, you can imagine that for those people, they're trying to tune their system. Like, they're doing their training, they're eating, they're trying to tune their system so that when they so within the hour, within the 10 minutes before they go up in that cage, they're at the exact state to be at their optimal. Like, they have this ideal, they have this ideal spirit of fighting. Like, actually, I was talking to my friend Brandon Laporte. He's a cage fighter. He actually, I met him at the MMA gym I used to go to for the pandemic. And I like talking to him about his philosophy of fighting. Like, he's like, man, I just want to go in there and I want to make that person, I want to make them suffer. Like, I want to make them feel like I never want to fight again, to the point where if they're at home on watching TV, they don't even want to watch it anymore.
Friends, Shannon.
Well, that's the thing. Let's be fair. He's locked in the cage with another person who's like, I want to break his face. Like, it's all fair, man. Do what you got to do. But he has this philosophy, like his approach is to do really annoying stuff. Like constant, like grabbing you and pushing you and like just constantly disrupting your rhythm. Basically, his thing is like disrupting your rhythm to the point where you're just frustrated and you just hate life.
Who did that? We watched that fight together where he just kept rubbing his blood into dude's face.
Oh, was that Tyson Fury? Did he?
No, it wasn't Fury. No, we watched that fight together. It was an MMA fight.
Oh yeah,
he kept rubbing his blood. The dude was frustrated beyond anything. Right. It was like, can this end already?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I forgot about that. Fight. But yeah, it's just one of those things where actually that idea of Persona, bringing that back again, this idea of giving one part of the system undue control over the system such that it starts putting the system in a worse position. To me, that's like a corrupted spirit. And that's actually how I view shadows. And I got that concept from Persona, because like in Persona 5, it's all about going through and identifying these people who have given themselves these trophies in their minds that allows them to treat people in a way that's just like, they're just spreading negativity. Like, if they're part of the larger network, they have become so obsessed with themselves that they actually in the game they give them they say these characters have a palace. Like, they go like real life. Like, they have a workplace where in that workplace they accomplished something in the past, and because of that accomplishment they think they can treat everyone like shit, and they're just like spreading misery to everybody. And the main goal of the characters is to go through and into their mind, identify which trophy has given them this inflated vision of themselves, and that inflated vision is a shadow. And so I think that when a subsystem gets control over the larger system, and it's has this inflated version of itself where it doesn't know its place. Like the digestive system goes, no, I should be at a 9. I should be at an 8. It's like, no, actually, you should probably be at a 3, bro.
Yeah.
Like, come on, you're just gonna kill us. You're gonna eat us to death. And like the thing is like the spirits that can be inside your system, there are more elaborate spirits than just your digestive system.
More complex ones.
Yeah, more complex ones. And these ones, they will feed you delusion, and you will eat that delusion right up, because the thing about these different states of being is during an interaction, the universe evolves differently. And as we said in, I think, the 3rd episode of the last season, when we're talking about high fidelity virtual reality, we start to realize that experience depends on changing configuration. Changing configuration depends on settings. And and so whatever configuration you're in, that's going to change the experience you have. So different personas, different waveforms, different spirits in your system, that affects which experiences you have. And if a certain system is willing to, like a certain subsystem is willing to, hey, if you believe that you're always a victim and that nothing's your fault, then you can constantly live out this fantasy, and it'll feed you delusions, and you're just like, it'll feed you that. And so these are some devious things, and you are just this spirit, this consciousness spirit stuck in this system. Don't even consider the system of your society and your culture, which you're also connected to, which has devious spirit.
We're talking about just yours that you're dealing with.
Just yours in its own. You're connected in this network of all these different spirits. And the thing is like, these spirits, whether they're good or bad, evil or not, it depends on what your control you're giving them. What relationship have you built with them? You have to recognize that it's your responsibility to create harmony and balance in that system.
Because it's never been a time where it's a great idea to give in, to give so much control to one spirit over the other, or especially over an extended period of time. It never ends well. It doesn't even matter what that thing is or how, great it might seem at the time. The moment you give that spirit that much control over an extended period of time, essentially making it more and more stable over time, it never ends well. I don't care what it is. Yeah, people who spend all their time at the gym, for example. Working out is great, but same thing.
The one that's I think killing so many people right now. It's the going on the internet and indulging in negative media, and like there's some person somewhere out there that's just like, all right, I know that if I put this out, I'll get 20,000 clicks, and people, and then I'll get all these advertisements, and I'll feed myself, and then you're just sitting there hooked up to this
thing, and the spirit is just getting more and more stable. Those waveforms are like getting more stable, just clear now. It's just going back and forth all day. Yep.
To the point where you can't even see reality anymore. Like you don't even know what up or down is, and you're just living in this. Because the thing about it is, this spirit's way of speaking, you can see that these waveforms or your model of reality, what you think is true, that part of having a model of what reality is, that's also part of your spirit. Because if you think that the state of the universe is one thing, then you'll behave differently than if you thought it was another way. And so what that means is that when you are interpreting reality, when you have an interaction with somebody and you're trying to figure out like, oh, I was offended. It's like, okay, are you offended because that person was an asshole, or are you offended because you were being too sensitive? Like it's, and if your model is always one in which it's because it's the other person's fault, what if it was actually your fault? And what that means is that two people could have that same interaction where one person, they leave going, oh, it's all good, man, my bad. And the other person's like, oh, this person really offended me. The same thing occurred, but the experience that you leave with it is different. It depends on your model of reality. And so this whole idea of spirit, like when you embody a specific waveform, you embody that thing, it affects your experience and
how you interact with the world, how the world interacts with you, all of that stuff. And like, one of the cliche things that you hear, it all starts from within. Yeah, it really does. That's not just a off the cuff statement. It really does start from within.
Yeah. Oh, I guess what I was trying to say is that your model, like your interpretation machine, like it interprets, and how you interpret things affects experience. And so it's all interconnected. Like, we just want to make sure that it's clear that this concept of spirit is tied to the evolution of the universe and waveforms, and that it's not something trivial. And I find that it's actually one of the most powerful languages to conceptualize reality, because then you actually start seeing, like,
especially when you personify
there are all these spirits. Yeah, especially when you personify it. There are all these spirits that are trying to influence me, and how they influence me affects my behavior. Do I want to suffer or not? What experiences do I have?
It's almost like you can visualize it as you know how in those cartoons they have the angel and the thing on the shoulder where they that's it. That's what it is. That's what it is.
Exactly. What they call that? Your conscious.
That's exactly what it is.
That's the whole point. And that's the thing. Like, when you see those things in cartoons, everyone sees that and no one's like confused.
No. We know exactly
Everyone knows
what
exactly what's going
on.
on. Everyone knows exactly what's going on. That's how you know it's an objective thing they're communicating to you. You always have this judgment that you're doing,
and you
weighing
have to be doing that, because the moment you give up doing that, it goes to chaos. Yeah,
it goes to chaos. Yeah, you'll drift. At that point, you'll just drift. Like, okay, well, the universe is now, like, I'm having interactions. Usually, if you're consciously aware, then you're applying forces so that you're not just rolling down the hill. You're not just a rock rolling down the hill.
Leaf in the wind, like tumbleweave.
Yeah, a leaf in the wind, exactly. And I was actually telling that to someone the other day. I was trying to give them some advice. But yeah, it's like when you just give up and just indulge in signals, and you actually just get rid of your responsibility as a consciousness protocol to weigh right from wrong, to be a filter. When you give your responsibility as a filter, then now you're just going to be, whatever signals come from the entire environment or entire system, you're just going to be dragged along that thing, and you better hope that it doesn't drag you off a cliff. But most likely it will drag you onto hell. You're going to be dragged into hell almost immediately. Like, let's be real here.
And so, and I think that what we want to leave listeners with today is the idea that these spirits, it's a good idea to personify them first off, because that kind of really gets you in the head space of really considering the fact that these systems, these spirits, are trying to influence your reality. They're trying to shape it. They're going to affect your experiences and your interactions, and it's up to you to be aware enough of the fact that you be aware enough of the spirits that you want to keep stable, and the spirits that you want to wrest control from, so that you can get to where you want to be, essentially.
Yeah. And it's also important to understand, I don't think we emphasize this enough, that when you define spirit this way, you have to understand that your spirit does not belong to you alone. It's on the network. It's on the network of all things that can interact, because your spirit is defined in terms of interactions. And so if you embody the spirit of a comedian, you don't own the label comedian.
You can't just label yourself funny.
Yeah, you can't just label yourself funny. You can't just demand that people view you or interact with you in a way that you want the interaction to be, because how your spirit is defined depends on
your funniness is tied to the
settings
network
of the other person. Yeah, it depends on the settings of the other person. When Dave Chappelle goes on stage, he has to be aware of what is the mind. And that's actually why I think he's so brilliant. I think he's really good at getting into the mindset of what people are thinking. So then he can be really good. Oh, well, they're thinking this, and I can just give them this, and this, and I can guarantee that the system's going to go into the state of laughter. And and so not only that, but you can kind of look at this waveforms that exist when you interact with somebody else. You can pass on that waveform to other people. If you see someone who is very kind and you like their philosophy of kindness, then you can be like, you know what? I'm going to start trying to act like that person. And then you can start acting in accordance with that person's way of thinking. And now suddenly there's a little bit of their spirit has now gone into you. And
even things like, bacon. You want to embody the spirit of bacon. You want to embody the spirit of a gamer, for example.
Fighter. Yeah.
Same thing. Yeah. I feel like even a lot of time, as with boxing and things like that, I know that sometimes I try to channel the spirit of Shannon boxing when I'm doing some things too. So definitely, for sure. Because I'm saying, gotta keep it straight, gotta keep it tight. So it's fun stuff, especially once you start to really personify these spirits, it makes it easier for you to really conceptualize. And those cartoons did it brilliantly with the devil on the shoulder, and it's brilliant. Yeah, that's exactly what's going on.
Well, when you mentioned the boxing, when I messed up my left hand, okay, again, it's all relational. Like your relationship, what's your relationship with the universe? It's like the universe itself. You interact with it based off the laws of physics. So I can't just choose to fly in the air. And so the way that you, like, for instance, if you're trying to dance, you're trying to do a backflip, it's almost like your body has to have a relationship with the universe such that you can actually perform the backflip. You have to actually have an understanding of the universe and which things have to occur. Like, how do I have to interact with it? I have to push off. I have to push off the ground.
Do I have to bend my legs or bend my back? Do I have to tuck my head?
Yep. And so that way of viewing it, like when I messed up my hand, I view my relationship, my consciousness has a relationship with that hand. And that relationship, like for a while, I felt like the hand died. Like my relationship with it was different. It was a different relationship when it was messed up. And when you start looking at your entire interaction with just the universe, you can actually start to see how you can personify the universe in that sense. And then you start realizing, well, wait a minute, all this is this system, this biochemical configurations that have been put into these waveforms, put into these configurations, which are associated with these waveforms, that have somehow managed to gather the capacity to be self-aware and to be able to be aware of its own existence to the point where it can start to predict the future. And you can start thinking, well, is that process just the process of the universe itself becoming aware? And are you just a subsystem of the universe that is just a portion of the universe? Like, the universe has all these configurations it can be in. And one of those configurations is the configuration of consciousness. And the universe just happened to evolve such that, given the set of all things it can be in, it evolved the ability to be self-aware, because the whole point of consciousness is to analyze the system, identify what it's going to do in the future, and then make predictions about its future behavior. So it has to come to a knowledge of self to be able to influence the future state of the system. And so, that's why you always hear people say that all the time, knowledge of self, when they're talking about like conscious rap and all that stuff.
A lot of those cliches, man, as much as people want to turn their nose up at them, there's so much truth in so many of them. I'll be walking around the house sometimes and a random one will pop in my head sometimes, and I'm like, it's a cliche, but, there's a lot of truth in that. And,
They become trite. And
people just don't acknowledge it anymore. But, we're saying all this just to say, guys, spirits do exist, within our systems. It might sound, a little difficult if you are not a religious person, or if you're a religious person anyway. But either way, these spirits are subsystems that exist in the universe. And, the more you nurture them, the more you repeat the same interactions over and over again. It gives the spirit life almost. It gives them, power. It gives them control over the system. And it's up to you to pick and choose how you want to regulate them, or what spirits you want to, preserve, or what spirits you want to nurture, and what spirits, you want to give more control over others.
Over the system, yeah. And the last thing I'll say, because we got to end with one of these, is when you look at it this way, as a human, you're like within your system, you're the consciousness. It's like, imagine yourself as the consciousness subsystem. But that consciousness subsystem is made up of a bunch of other subsystems. And then those subsystems are made up of more subsystems.
All
and
the
then
way
if
down.
you go outward, and then if you go outward, you are an individual within a larger system, your family, your community, your society, and so you can see that when you're looking at when you're going from, it's just subsystems all the way down, basically. It's subsystems all the way down. It's spirits all the way down, because each subsystem has a spirit. Each subsystem is made up of constituent parts that depending on their state, have the capacity to affect the configuration of that subsystem, which that's nested in the next one, and on and on. It's just nested in subsystems all the way down. It's like networks all the way down. And when you are tuning your relationship with the spirits in your system, you are navigating the space of spirits So it is this space of configurations. It is this space of metaphors. It's the conceptual space.
Space
it's the,
all the way down.
Space of spirits. It's vectors all the way down because these are different locations. It's navigation all the way down. Like when you're a filter, you're making judgment statements. You're interpreting. So it's like interpreting literature. Like all of these things are tied to the concept of causal structure, information and information flow. That's what these things are tied to. And you can see how this network of concepts are all correlated to each other to create a grand narrative. And this is what we're trying to communicate to people. And we're hoping that by having these conversations and people listen to this enough, they can start seeing the symmetries on their own, and then they can start generating them on their own. Then they can start using the language. And then and the whole point is that if you listen to the podcast, we're not telling you have to think this way. We are making arguments.
Why it is an effective way to think about this stuff.
Is this convincing? Yeah. Does it help you program the system? Is it convincing? Yeah. It's like the whole thing is, we have a prediction as to whether or not these arguments can program people such that they'll be convinced by them. Just like Dave Chappelle can go on stage and determine whether or not he'll make people laugh. Yep. And this is an experiment to us. Will this program people the way that we're trying to program them? And the whole point is that it's not a language that dictates how you should think. It's just asking us to agree on a set of definitions so that we can communicate our settings as honestly and sincerely as possible.
And we're doing clumsy.
Less clumsy. And we're trying to do it using concepts that can be observed independently of any person. That's why we're tying the concept of spirit to how the universe evolves, measurement outcomes, information theory. This is what we're doing here.
But, like always, guys, if you have any questions, you can send us an email. Shout out to Christoph, by the way. I think that was our first email. So shout out to Christoph for that.
Yeah, man, we appreciate that.
And you can send us an email at thebottomtitle@gmail.com. You can hit us up on social media. We are on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at The Bottom Title Podcast. My personal Instagram is Mr. Ballpoint. And yours, I think, is Playa Papa Papa something.
Nah, you put an extra pa in there. It's Playa Papa Papa. It's PLAYPAPAPA. That's my
Playa
my
Papa or something. Yeah, but
that was my gamer tag back in college.
Do you still use it
on Xbox? No. Nah. My gamer tag now, even though I don't play online games much, is Mr. Sir Dr. Daddy.
All right. But like always, if you agree with us, let us know. If you disagree, also let us know. We want all that data. It really does help us talk more about these episodes and, conceptualize some of these ideas better. But thanks for joining us today. You can hit us up on social media, like we said, and you can catch us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever else you get your podcasts. And thanks for being with us.
Tell your friends.
Like,
if you like
share,
it,
subscribe.
like that, tell your friends.
And we will see you guys next time. Stay turtling, my friends.
Stay turtling, my friends. Peace.